Hello, my name is Robert Edward Bradley. I'm here to introduce you to the Retro Music Library. I was a gigging musician up until my late teens, early 20s, doing a lot of touring all over Europe and playing lead guitar in various bands. And I loved it, but it was, I liked to party a bit too much, to be honest with you. And I personally found that I liked being in the studio much more, and I liked creating music. And also I wanted to start a family at a young age, so I gave up the whole touring life and focused in on being a producer and writer. So I got a job at a production house called Xenomania, which is where we produced and wrote for a lot of big pop artists. It's where Girls Aloud went after winning their big TV show, and where most of their big hits were written and produced. Tons of big pop acts would come through there, from Kylie Minogue, Natalie Imbruglia, Sugar Babes, even Britney Spears at one point. A really intriguing place to work, completely different to anything I'd ever done before. And it gave me a really different discipline to the whole writing and production process. The guy who ran the place, he had a pretty hardcore work ethic, which I really admired. But on the downside, it felt like there was a lot of creativity going to waste, because we would make so much music, and then 2 or 3 of them would become big hits, which was amazing, but then the rest of the music would kind of get forgotten about. And I felt like I wanted that music to have a home. And a friend of mine, a musician friend, he said, well, have you thought about production music? And I'd never heard of production music or library music before. And he said, well, you should look into it because it can be lucrative and it can be a good home for your music. And so I started doing a little bit on the side, and I realized it was getting used all over the place, all around the world, on different TV shows and films and adverts. And so I started doing it more, and then it became pretty much my day job. I've always been like hyper productive, so I make so much music and I want for it to be out there working for me. Making production music suits me down to the ground, because it means I can just keep on making music and collaborating with friends and going into studios all over the shop, as well as doing stuff here. It's a great job to have. I would highly recommend it to any musicians, writers, composers and producers who are looking for another outlet. It's a fantastic part of the business to be in. The 2 key differences are, when you're working with an artist, you are working around a full vocal, and all the music and the production has to work around the vocal, which is sat right at the top of the mix, and everything needs to work around that. Whereas in production music, your primary purpose is to evoke a certain feeling or emotion or sentiment. So when it's put to the visual, it really helps tell the story. Other differences, I guess, like when you're working with artists, a lot of the time there's a lot of people involved. It can be the artist, a couple of producers and 2 or 3 other top-line writers. For instance, Sugar Babe stuff I've written in the past there was like 10 writers involved in some of that. It doesn't allow you the creative freedom that you would have if you were doing it with less people. But then I work with artists like Johnny Depp, for example, where it's just me and him working together, and he lets me just get on with what I do, and that works really well. It does all depend on who the artist is, what kind of music it is. If it's pop music, there's more writers involved, whereas if it's like an alternative act, it's usually just the act and the producer that are working on the material together. It's not as manufactured, as it were. More and more production music is getting listened to now on Spotify and Apple Music and YouTube. A lot of people are like sourcing production music because they hear it on TV and they want to listen to it on their iPod and things, which is fantastic. It means that production music is finding its way into the commercial world. I was brought up on rock and roll when I was a kid, and I was playing in the working men's clubs up north from the age of 10, doing all like Buddy Holly, Everly Brothers, Eddie Cochran, Gene Vincent. I got into jazz in my early teens and explored Django Reinhardt, Joe Pass, all that kind of swing stuff. And then I got into the whole indie scene in my later teens, joined a band in Bristol that was quite a well-known indie band. And that then introduced me to the whole Bristol subculture, the Wild Bunch, Massive Attack thing, the trip-hop, Portishead, but then the drum and bass, Ronnie Size, all that stuff. Because I've been doing production music for a long time now, like 20 odd years or more than that. I would analyse, see how the music's doing on the royalty statements. It was a timeless classics that would just keep earning. Music that had like a timeless sound to it. I do make a lot of contemporary music, but it kind of lasts 2, 3, 4, 5 years and then it starts petering out. Whereas the old classics, music that sounds timeless, that just keeps earning year after year. You know, it made me think, hang on a minute, I should really zone in a bit more on that kind of music and make more of it. I wanted this label to feel like it was real music, recorded in great studios with great musicians. And I wanted it to cover everything from the 1900s all the way up to like 10 years ago. Library records of the 60s and 70s and Bruton archives, incredibly recorded, and the compositions, you know, like that was a great starting point. I mean, they've been sampled to death as well by hip-hop artists and still used today. You know, you can still go into the Universal catalogue and access them old tracks. I've actually remixed some of them, which was a real honour. You know, the dusty old blues from the early part of the century, going into the 20s and 30s swing thing, which I have a big passion for, from like Glenn Miller to Benny Goodman, Tommy Dorsey, Count Basie, all of that stuff. So hooky and such feel-good kind of vibes. You know, I wanted to make sure that that was in the first run of albums we did. And then some of the orchestral stuff from post-war Hollywood, like the glitzy, glamoury stuff, but then that Bernard Herrmann thing, The Day the Earth Stood Still and all that. So we wanted to do an album like that. We've got one of them covered. And then you go into the 60s, you got like the beat pop, the psychedelia thing. I wanted to capture that using the same techniques, having the drummer use the same kind of drum skins, mic it up in the same way to get that classic kind of sound. And then going into the 70s, you've got that incredible funky stuff, like the Meters, James Brown, Jimmy Smith, that Hammond stuff. They just nailed it. And, you know, people have sampled that to death, and there's a reason. It's because it sounds so bloody good. And then going into the 80s, you know, the New Romantics, the synthwave stuff, but then that kind of post-punk thing, Joy Division, The Cure, the early 90s shoegaze thing, and then the grunge stuff. Then hitting all the rave thing and the Manchester scene. So the label will cover each and every one of these genres and eras. So the first 10 albums, we've gone all the way back to the 30s. We've got a great swing album called Swingers, which is already doing well, actually. Going into the 50s, we've covered some of the sci-fi, that theremin and strings thing. We've got that covered. The old black and white movies of Hollywood. The spaghetti western thing with the strings and the tremolo guitars. The 70s, we've got that kinky, funky thing happening. 2 albums of that. Hammond, brass, guitars. We've got the 80s thing, them lush analog synths, them classic old drum machines from that era. I've just finished a Psychobilly album, which is that surf punk, fuzzy garage thing. That sounds really good, really different. Then there's a more contemporary one called Orchestral Textures, which is more like nature kind of programs. A couple I'm working on at the moment. One is Kinky Mambo, which is like that sassy, Latin, Cuban kind of piano and brass. We did the brass down in London the other month. That's going to be great for all kinds of things. And then 90s breakbeats. I've got my son helping out with that. We've recorded a lot of it live here, and then he's doing a bit of rapping and singing on it too. Very authentic to the era. I made a lot of music in that era. That's going to be good. 2 other orchestral ones that we've recorded already that I'm about to get onto mixing, which is Film Noir and Spy, so they both kind of do what they say on the tin. And we've got a couple of Christmas ones happening. One is like Quartet Christmas, which we recorded in Prague with a wonderful string quartet, doing all the old Christmas classics. And we've also got a nice a cappella Christmas album happening, which is like the old doo-wop, barbershop kind of a cappella voices Christmas thing. That sounds really nice. A couple of heavier albums, guitar stuff from the 70s. I'm really pleased with how that's coming along. So in its first 2 or 3 years, the Retro label should cover pretty much all of the eras and genres of the past 100 years or so. For me, it's all about the hooks. I think it's just the way I've been brought up. You know, when I was writing songs when I was a kid, my dad would say, it needs to have a good chorus. When I worked in the pop production house, again, great riffs, great top lines. That was the key to having a hit. And I think the same principle applies to production music. So the hooks are the fundamental part of the track. The track can be built around the hook. Sometimes you work towards the hook. It kind of depends. Initial starting points, some kind of groove or beat can inspire a hook. Some kind of orchestral library, maybe something from Spitfire, you know, as soon as you start playing them, they can inspire a certain lyrical phrase or something that comes out, and that will eventually get played by real orchestra. If it's a guitar track or a keys track, like a funky thing or a rocky thing, the riff has to be killer, you know, it has to be a great riff that, you know, as soon as you hear it, you're like, yeah, that means business. Sometimes I might put some visuals on the iPad. It could be some like black and white footage if I'm doing like some of the film noir stuff, or like spaghetti western, put some old cowboy movies on. It's whatever it takes to get the inspiration. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the label is built on great players as well as the great compositions. Some of the composers, they play instruments really well themselves, but I'm blessed to have like a huge pool of talented musicians who are good friends of mine, from violinists to drummers to trumpet players to harmonica players to, you know, I've worked with so many musicians over the years, and I like to try and involve them in the writing process if possible. And if not, then we will set up sessions and they can earn well out of doing the session work. For instance, there's a drummer called Paul Stewart who's played with everyone from Roger Daltrey, Sophie Ellis-Bextor. He's in a band called The Feeling, who are a great band, and he can play in any style. You know, he's one of these drummers that can adapt to anything and play with a click but with feel, which is a real art. Producers will know. Some drummers will play to a click and it'll sound like awful, almost like computerized, whereas other drummers can play to a click and lay back a bit and add that feel to it that's really crucial. Saxophone and woodwind, I use a guy called Dave Bishop who's played with everyone from Ella Fitzgerald to Robbie Williams to Amy Winehouse to all the Mark Ronson stuff. He played on Uptown Funk and things like that. And then for orchestra, depending on budget, it's London, Abbey Road or Prague. And you know, Prague is one of these places, I mean, it's got such a rich history of classical music. There's an abundance of wonderful musicians there and great halls to record. There's a really good studio there we use a lot. We will go out and record where we need to, and often, a lot of the times, it's recorded in here at the Black Lodge. So yeah, like I was saying, more and more we go to Prague for recording orchestra and choir and like orchestral brass. There's a studio there called Smeki, which has a beautiful live room. It's really vintage sounding, so it really suits the Retro label. It's where we've done most of the orchestral recording for the label. And a fantastic orchestra over there too. The control room has a big, beautiful Neve console, the very same one that's in Abbey Road actually. Abbey Road is another studio we use if the budget is a bit higher. And then if it's like rhythm section or like, you know, moderner stuff like indie, rock and things like that, we record it here at my studio, the Black Lodge. And I've got a Neve console too. It's not quite as posh as the one at Abbey Road or the one in Smeki, but it's still a Neve console. It's the same preamps and the same analog circuitry. It's just a bit more compact than the large format consoles. But the beautiful thing about here at the Black Lodge is it's got a certain atmosphere and vibe, which is why artists like Youngblood and Johnny Depp and Jeff Beck, they all love coming here because it's got a certain ambience to it, and you just shut the door at night and all you want to do is just create music. And it's all self-contained, there's 6 bedrooms, 2 kitchens, but everything tie-lined. So if an artist wakes up in bed one morning and they want to record the vocals in bed, I can quite easily just patch it up to the bedroom and they can record vocals in bed. Yeah, it's quite a unique place. And like downstairs we've got a different room that's more modern for like when I'm doing dance music or more futuristic kind of sounds. And it's got a different set of speakers there, so I'd like to check the mixes in each room to make sure it's all sounding how it should. We've got loads of drum kits here, guitars, basses, amps. The beautiful old Hammond there that's like from the mid-60s that was in a nunnery, so it's like in pristine condition. The classic B3 Hammond, we've got Fender Rhodes, Wurlitzers. An abundance of instruments here, The majority of the retro music library is created, or it begins from here. I think the main difference with the retro music library to other labels is that it is like era specific, so it's going to cover all of the eras of the past 100 years or more. It's actually color coded, so each decade has a colour. So, if you look already, there's 2 50s ones and they're like a red colour. Once the catalogue grows, them colours will become, if you want 60s music, to go to the brown colour, for example. Not only is the music recorded similar to that era and played with that same kind of finesse as the era, also, we've done mixes, so that as well as having all the normal versions, the cut downs, the 1 minute, the 30, the stings, the instrumentals, underscores. We've also done vintage mixes. We've done it through vinyl, so you hear all the record crackle, we've used some emulations to make it sound very much like it was recorded in the 30s. So you've got like a more contemporary yet still 30s sounding mix, but then you've got a really vintage sounding mix as well. You have them options. If you had like old black and white archival footage, you could pull up the really old sounding mix, whereas if it's like just a backdrop to something that's 30s inspired, then you might just use the more contemporary sounding mix. What makes it stand out from other labels is the quality of playing. Like I said earlier, I'm blessed to have such a talented pool of brilliant musicians who I work with, and you can hear that on each record. All the playing is impeccable, and I'd like to think that the production and the mixing is done in the same way. It's something I've been doing a long time, so I feel like there's a lot of love being put into the production and the mix. The quality of the music is excellent. To sum the retro music library up, it's a label that covers all the eras of the past 100 years or more. Recorded in the same style, composed by composers who are brilliant in their specific field, carefully chosen players, carefully chosen studios, recorded authentically, all the mixes that editors need, plus the vintage mixes as well. Made with a lot of love. And hopefully as each album is let loose in the universal catalogue, the Retro Music Library will be the go-to place for authenticity, quality and diversity.